Universal credit has never been enough to support families. We need a universal basic income. From Drew Hendry, the bandpot that represents the city I'm from, Inverness. It's great to see such a informative, intelligent man at the helm representing the land I'm from. When this pandemic ends, the economic recovery is going to be long and hard. Universal basic income will help settle economic stability and lead to increased spending in local economies, supporting businesses and communities. And how many businesses are going to be able to emerge at the other end of this? Because bear in mind, it's not the pandemic that has caused any of this disorder in society. It is the actions taken by governments all across Europe, really, other parts of the world, but mainly in Europe with their hardcore stringent rules in some places. People feel happy when they're in control of their own lives. The opposite of that feeling is one of not being in control. A state we have all become familiar with as we face this silent enemy together. Indeed, feelings of being powerless, fearful or anxious are commonplace in every household, playing on people's fears. That's what you do best at the S&P, am I right in saying? You know, there was only the other day that they had an article talking about over 40% of people are concerned about income during COVID-19 lockdown. Citizens Advice Scotland finds totally independent NGOs and think tanks, you see. You know, they have no influence on government policy. No, of course not. But this says here, for example, in a survey carried out by the Scott Pulse pollster, 14% of people said they were concerned about their incomes, with a further 27% saying they were fairly concerned. Of those worried about money, 31% said they were concerned about utility bills, rent and debt repayments. In addition, 27% are concerned about mortgage repayments, and the same number are concerned about paying for food and other essentials. 29% say they worry about paying council tax, which the SNP let the councils have the ability to rise themselves. The SNP promised a few years ago, I can't remember off the top of my head which year they made this promise, but they pledged to reduce or even scrap council tax. I can't recall the ins and outs of it, but the premise is the same nonetheless. And what did they do when they got in? Well, they gave the councils the ability to rise council tax. But yet they've got the audacity to then play on people's financial insecurities. They've got a habit of doing that, I'm noticing. Then it goes on to say, what advisors across the Citizens Advice Network were seeing before COVID-19 was the issue of people struggling to pay for key bills as a result of a lack of income in the first place. Right? With over 40% of people in our survey concerned about their income, there is a real risk the pandemic makes this a more serious issue for a larger group of people. Both the Scottish and UK governments, as well as industry regulators, have taken significant steps to ease the short-term pressure on people meeting the cost of daily living. Our message to people is that support is there and to access the support you are entitled to. Across the country, the Citizens Advice Network has adapted to these changed circumstances, with cabs across the country still delivering advice in these challenging times. Network has also established a national helpline, yada yada. But what's the solution to financial insecurity though? Well, let's just roll out a universal basic income. It's not like that was in the pipeline previously, of course. So anyway, he goes on to say, what will happen if they can't make their rent, or what happens when their mortgage holiday is over? Will their job still be there after all of this? That is, if it hasn't already gone. And somebody else said, or the SNP's handyman on Twitter said, it's time for an emergency universal basic income so that no one is left behind. No one is left behind. This is a quote that you will see time and time again from Sustainable Developments. They talk about it more often than not. When they're not mentioning sustainable in every second sentence, it's no one being left behind. Yeah, it's cute. Yet still insecurity remains, and that's what you love. You love preying on people's insecurity. Sure, they can benefit from 80% of their wages, but people don't routinely save 20% of their salaries. With their household income reduced, any savings on regular transport costs can quickly be eaten up. And they are the lucky ones. Just think of what it's like for those who rely on seasonal work, people who have been working in the gig economy and are newly self-employed. They find themselves having to live off the woefully inadequate universal credit social security payment. That's after they wait over 2 weeks for a callback with a further 5-week wait for payment. Universal credit has never been enough to support families. It simply wasn't designed to be, and as the legions of new claimants are finding out, it doesn't scratch the surface of living costs. And what are you doing to ease the burden of living costs in Scotland, Drew? What are the SNP doing in Scotland? Well, the SNP sit there and whine and moan, or they pretend to care about your woes and your insecurities and your life because it's so hard done by because of the SNP, but they pretend it's austerity and every other excuse in the playbook. You know, they're pissing money away on pupil equity funding, for example. It's just one of many. examples I could pull up, but I've made several videos showing what they piss our money away on. But this is just the latest one, the 1st of May. 250 million direct to schools between 2020 to 2022. They're more concerned about ensuring everybody has the same outcome depending on what colour of skin they've got and whatnot than they are about people in poverty, child poverty, food banks, homelessness, people that can't afford homes, etc, etc. Making it harder and harder and turning the screws on families while they pump money into this bollocks. Possible justification is there for spending that amount of money on trying to reduce an attainment gap that bared no relevance prior to their original interference in this whole charade, and they've made no difference since they've been in this sphere of education. If anything, they have consistently, year on year, made it worse. Loans need to be paid back, and with an uncertain future ahead of us, many people will simply be unable to afford to do so. And what are you doing about it, Drew? What are the SNP going to do about it? Well, let's get the scoop, shall we, as they talk about inequality. Fuck you, Drew. Universal basic income tells it will disincentivise work. Of course it will disincentivise work. Why bother getting a job when you can sit on your arse and get money for nothing? There's your first issue. This is coming from somebody that's poor. The second issue, of course, is who pays for all of this? Who pays all of this money into a pot for people to be disincentivised effectively? Universal credit is something that I was on years ago, and I hated it. Granted, I despised it. But at the very least, one thing that came out of it is it does kind of incentivise you to get a job because you want off it as soon as possible. The same can't be said for paying people to sit on their arse regardless of their circumstances. The other issue that I have with universal basic income is the fact that it entices more people over here. And that's what this is fundamentally about, or one of the reasons for it. And of course, when this pandemic does end, the economic recovery is going to be long and hard. Well, you're going to make it a lot harder though, aren't you, Drew? Aren't you? Journey to a future of even greater automation of traditional workplaces will hasten. The marketplace will adapt, as will the way we interact with it. So wait a minute, you're talking about automation of traditional workplaces, but yet you want immigrants to come over here because there's going to be a shortage in the workforce? A bit of a contradiction starting to emerge here from that bio, Drewy boy. And of course, he wants to talk about economic recovery. Well, I struggle to see where this economic recovery is going to come from, as they're intending to, say goodbye to oil and gas. That's coming. It was always coming because they're peddling the climate change bollocks. But environmental campaigners say the government support to stimulate oil and gas industry could be locking the country into another non-existent crisis. It comes in response to the Oil and Gas UK industry report and their proposals for a recovery strategy. The report says 1 in 5 jobs could be lost by the sector as the pandemic exacerbates already plummeting oil prices. The industry body has outlined a 3-stage plan. However, it calls for the addressing of the industry's immediate needs. However, Friends of the Earth Scotland Just Transition campaigner Ryan Morrison, totally independent of government of course, said any measures that seek to return the oil and gas industry back to how it was before are ignoring the fundamental vulnerability of the sector, locking in further disruption from the escalating climate crisis that doesn't exist. Look at the CO2 figures for the last month or so of CO2 in the atmosphere while the world has been in a lockdown or next to a lockdown. There's been no changes to the CO2 in the atmosphere because around about 97%, 96% of CO2 in the atmosphere isn't created by man. So there is no climate crisis. If anything, this lockdown has proven that to be the case, that man-made climate change is bollocks. He added, any financial package must not be used to support companies' continued expansion, continued exploration or development of new fields. The climate emergency demands that these activities must be brought to an end. Of course! We must now look to build our green economy. And how is that going to rebuild our economy or bring people out of poverty, Drew? How is Scotland's green economy really going to entangle the web of impoverishment? I failed to see, Drew. Are wind turbines really going to create the pretty pennies that you talk about? No, I don't think so. It is that to regain any semblance of normal life within any reasonable acceptable timescale, we're going to need to commit to structural support for our people. So let me get it straight. You create a lockdown, you create financial unrest, you create all the problems that you've now got the solutions for. It's just a pretty pattern that emerges more often than not with you people.